How many times have you heard that losing belly fat is all about moving more and eating less? That if you just cut your calories and get to the gym, the weight will eventually come off? And how many times have you actually tried that, stuck with it for a while, and found yourself right back where you started, frustrated, hungry, and wondering why your body refuses to cooperate? The reason that approach keeps failing most people has nothing to do with willpower or effort. It has to do with signals. Your body does not respond to calorie restriction the way diet culture has always told you it does. It responds to something far more specific. And once you understand what that signal actually is, the path to losing belly fat becomes remarkably clear. Hello, health champions. Today I am going to show you the one protein hack that can help your body start burning belly fat without setting foot in a gym. And I am going to explain the biology behind why it works so that you never have to guess or rely on someone else's word for it again. Let us start with the foundation, because this is where most people have been given incomplete information for years. Your body does not have calorie receptors. Read that again. There is no mechanism inside you that detects how many calories you consumed and decides whether you are full based on that number. Fullness, real biological satiety, the signal that genuinely tells your brain to stop eating, is based on two things and two things only: protein and fat. Those are the two signals your body actually tracks. Those are the two nutrients that, when present in sufficient amounts, trigger the hormonal cascade that shuts off hunger and tells the system it has been adequately fed. Carbohydrates do not do this. Carbohydrates do not trigger satiety. They do not send a fullness signal. They spike your blood sugar, trigger an insulin response, and then as blood sugar drops, drive you right back to hunger again, often within an hour or two of eating. That cycle is the reason so many people eat high carbohydrate diets and feel like they cannot stop eating no matter how much food they consume. Protein is the first satiety signal and the most powerful one. And the reason it works the way it does is deeply logical. Your body needs protein, not in the vague, general sense that it needs nutrients. It needs protein specifically and urgently for a list of functions it cannot perform without it, building and repairing every tissue in your body, manufacturing the hormones that regulate virtually every process you depend on, constructing the immune cells that protect you from infection, maintaining the structural integrity of your skin, your connective tissue, your organs. Your body is constantly tracking how much protein it has received and whether that amount is adequate to cover all of these demands. And here is the critical piece. Until your body is satisfied that it has received enough protein to meet those needs, it will continue sending hunger signals. It does not matter how many calories you have consumed. It does not matter whether you have eaten until you feel physically stuffed. If the protein requirement has not been met, the hunger signal keeps firing. This is why the protein hack works for belly fat specifically. When you structure your eating so that protein is the primary driver of your meals, you naturally stop eating sooner, stay satisfied longer, and avoid the repeated cycles of eating and hunger that drive fat accumulation over time. You are not fighting your appetite through willpower. You are using the body's own satiety signaling system to regulate intake the way it was designed to. The belly fat piece connects directly to this because chronic overeating driven by unmet protein needs, combined with the insulin spikes from high carbohydrate eating, is one of the primary mechanisms through which visceral fat, the fat stored deep in the abdominal cavity, accumulates and persists. Now let me explain the second signal because it is equally important and almost always overlooked in conversations about protein. The second satiety signal is fat, specifically dietary fat consumed alongside protein. Fat slows gastric emptying, meaning it causes food to leave your stomach more slowly and enter the bloodstream more gradually. But beyond that mechanical effect, fat triggers the release of a hormone called cholecystokinin, or CCK. CCK does two things simultaneously. It signals the gallbladder to contract and release bile to support digestion, and it sends a powerful, fast-acting fullness signal to the brain that is completely separate from the protein satiety pathway. Two independent signals, both triggered, both working at once. This is why the smartest approach to the protein hack is not to seek out the leanest, most fat-stripped protein sources available. It is to eat protein and fat together in the same meal, in the natural combinations that whole foods provide. Eggs contain both. Fatty cuts of beef contain both. Full-fat dairy contains both. Salmon and other fatty fish contain both. Ground beef contains both. When you eat these foods, you are triggering both satiety signals simultaneously, which produces a fullness that is deeper, more stable, and far longer lasting than anything you can produce with carbohydrates or with isolated protein sources stripped of their natural fat content. This is also why people who switch to this kind of eating are frequently astonished to discover that they stop thinking about food between meals in a way they never experienced before. It is not a psychological victory, it is a physiological one. Now I want to go deeper into the specific mechanism that makes protein particularly powerful for body composition, because this is the part of the science that most general health content never covers, and it changes how you think about when and how much protein to eat. Inside every meal containing adequate protein, something very specific happens in your muscles. Protein contains a collection of amino acids, and one of those amino acids, leucine, plays a unique and critical role. Leucine acts as a direct trigger for a biological switch called mTOR, which stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. That name is technical, but the function is straightforward. mTOR is your body's primary muscle building and tissue repair activation switch. When it gets turned on, your body shifts into a mode of active repair, rebuilding, and maintenance that consumes energy, preserves existing muscle tissue, and prevents the kind of metabolic slowdown that makes belly fat so persistent and so hard to shift. The threshold that triggers a meaningful mTOR response is approximately 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine, which corresponds to roughly 25 to 30 grams of protein from whole food sources in a single meal. Below that threshold, the switch fires weakly or not at all. At and above that threshold, you get a robust activation that lasts for 3 to 5 hours. This is the specific protein number that matters for each meal, not a daily total spread however you like, but 25 to 30 grams per sitting as a minimum to trigger the repair and muscle preservation response that keeps your metabolism running efficiently as you lose fat. Here is why this matters specifically for belly fat. One of the primary reasons that visceral belly fat is so stubborn in people who diet is that conventional calorie restriction causes the body to lose muscle alongside fat. When muscle mass decreases, metabolic rate decreases with it, because muscle is metabolically active tissue that burns energy continuously. Lose muscle while dieting and your body becomes progressively better at storing fat and worse at burning it, which is why the weight that comes back after a conventional diet typically comes back as more fat and less muscle than you started with. The protein hack, structured around adequate protein per meal to trigger mTOR, prevents this by giving your body the signal and the raw material it needs to preserve and repair muscle tissue even while overall body fat is decreasing. You maintain the metabolic machinery that makes fat burning sustainable over time. So what does adequate protein actually look like in practice? The traditional recommendation of 50 to 60 grams of protein per day, which is what most general dietary guidelines suggest, is genuinely insufficient to trigger consistent satiety signaling or reliable mTOR activation. Research on protein requirements puts the range for meaningful metabolic benefit at approximately 1.2 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. For a person weighing 75 kilograms or about 165 pounds, that translates to roughly 90 to 165 grams of protein daily, depending on activity level, age, and body composition goals. This is considerably higher than what most people currently eat, and considerably higher than what most conventional diet advice recommends, which is part of why most conventional diet advice fails to produce lasting results for belly fat specifically. Age matters here in a specific way worth understanding. As you get older, two things happen that shift the protein calculation upward. First, the anabolic hormones that facilitate protein synthesis in muscle, primarily growth hormone and testosterone, naturally decline, which means more protein input is required to achieve the same degree of muscle maintenance and repair response. Second, digestive efficiency for breaking down and absorbing protein can decline with age, partly due to lower stomach acid production, which means that even of the protein you eat, you may be absorbing a smaller proportion than a younger person would from the same meal. If you are over 50, erring toward the higher end of the protein range, closer to 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram, is likely to produce better results than the lower end. And this higher intake becomes even more important if maintaining muscle and managing belly fat are priorities for you. Now let us talk about the one simple hack specifically, because the theory is only useful if you know how to apply it. The hack has two parts that work together as a single strategy. Part one is this: make protein the first thing you eat at every meal, not the last thing, not something you add to an otherwise carbohydrate-heavy plate as an afterthought. The first several bites of every meal should be your protein source before anything else goes in. The reason this matters is that eating protein first allows it to begin triggering the satiety pathway before the rest of the meal arrives. The CCK response from fat and the hormonal protein satiety response take time to ramp up, and by starting with protein and fat before eating anything else, you give those signals time to build before you have filled your plate with everything on offer. People who eat protein first consistently report eating smaller overall portions without any deliberate effort to restrict, because the satiety signals are already active before the rest of the meal is consumed. Part 2 is structuring your daily protein intake across 2 meals rather than spreading it across 3 or trying to fit it all into one. Here is the specific reason 2 meals works better than the alternatives for the goal of burning belly fat. If you eat 1 meal per day and try to consume all of your daily protein in that single sitting, your body faces a hard ceiling on how much protein it can use at once. The maximum amount of protein that can be utilized from a single meal is approximately 40 to 70 grams, depending on body size and activity level. Anything consumed beyond that ceiling cannot be used for tissue repair or muscle maintenance. Instead, it gets converted to glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. This is not as metabolically disruptive as eating carbohydrates directly, but it does generate a glucose load that can slow fat burning and compromise the metabolic state you are trying to maintain. If you eat 2 meals per day, spaced several hours apart, each containing 30 to 60 grams of quality protein, you accomplish several things simultaneously. You stay within the usable range of protein per sitting, so most or all of what you consume actually gets directed toward repair and muscle maintenance, rather than being converted to glucose. You trigger mTOR twice, producing 2 separate muscle building and repair episodes across the day, rather than just one. You maintain a meaningful fasting window between your last meal and your first the following day, which supports insulin sensitivity and the hormonal environment that allows fat burning to occur. And you trigger both the protein satiety signal and the fat satiety signal at each meal, which means hunger is genuinely managed rather than simply suppressed by willpower. The practical implementation looks like this. Your first meal of the day, whenever that naturally falls for you, should contain at least 30 grams of protein alongside a meaningful amount of natural fat. Eggs cooked in butter, a piece of salmon, ground beef, full-fat Greek yogurt with no added sugar. These are not arbitrary choices. They are whole foods that naturally deliver both satiety signals simultaneously. Your second meal, 4 to 6 hours later, follows the same principle. Protein first, fat alongside it, vegetables from the non-starchy category to support gut health without driving a carbohydrate spike. If you consume carbohydrates at all, eat them after you have had your protein and fat, not before or instead of them, because protein and fat eaten first will blunt the glycemic effect of whatever carbohydrates follow. I want to address something directly that comes up frequently when people first hear about structuring eating around 2 meals per day. Some people worry that eating less frequently means they will be hungrier, not less hungry. The opposite is almost universally what actually happens, and the reason comes back to the satiety signals we have been discussing. 3 meals per day built around carbohydrates produces 3 blood sugar spikes and 3 corresponding drops, each one driving a new wave of hunger within an hour or 2 of eating, sometimes faster. 2 meals built around protein and fat produces 2 deep, sustained fullness responses that last 4 to 6 hours without any meaningful blood sugar disruption in between. You are not eating less food in any meaningful sense. You are eating food that satisfies the actual signals rather than food that temporarily quiets the system and then restarts the hunger cycle. The transition from one pattern to the other typically takes 1 to 2 weeks as the body adjusts. And most people report that by the second week, the appetite change feels natural rather than effortful. The foods that make this hack easiest are the naturally fatty protein sources I have already mentioned. Eggs are perhaps the single most practical option, being inexpensive, quick to prepare, and containing an ideal balance of protein, fat, and micronutrients in a form that your body recognizes and utilizes extremely well. Beef, particularly cuts that retain their natural fat, is another excellent choice. Fatty fish, including salmon, mackerel, and sardines, provide both protein and omega-3 fatty acids, which have their own separate anti-inflammatory and metabolic benefits. Full-fat dairy in the form of plain Greek yogurt, real cheese, and whole milk cottage cheese rounds out the practical everyday list. What you are avoiding is the category of foods that dominates most diet advice, the low-fat, high-protein options that deliver protein stripped of its natural fat and paired instead with carbohydrates to make up the calorie balance. Fat-free yogurt loaded with added sugar. Protein bars built on a foundation of processed grain flour and artificial sweeteners, grilled chicken eaten alongside a large portion of rice or bread. These combinations deliver protein in a context that undermines both satiety signals and drives the kind of blood sugar variability that keeps hunger persistent and belly fat stubborn. One more piece of practical guidance that ties everything together. If you currently eat in a way that is heavily carbohydrate dependent, the transition to this approach does not have to be dramatic or immediate. Start by identifying the protein source at each of your current meals and make that the first thing you eat. Notice what happens to your hunger and your portion sizes over the first week without changing anything else. Most people find that this single shift, eating protein first, begins changing their intake naturally without any deliberate restriction. From there, gradually increase the protein content of each meal toward the 30 grams per sitting threshold, replacing carbohydrate portions rather than adding to total food volume. As protein and fat become the primary drivers of your meals, the carbohydrate portion naturally becomes smaller and less central, which progressively reduces the insulin driving cycle that has been storing belly fat all along. And here's something worth saying clearly before we close, because I think it matters more than the specific numbers or the timing details. This approach does not require you to white-knuckle your way through hunger. It does not require tracking every gram of food you eat or spending hours in a gym. It requires understanding what your body actually responds to and giving it that consistently, meal by meal. The gym is not a bad thing. Exercise has genuine value for health, cardiovascular function, mental clarity, and bone density. But belly fat is not primarily a gym problem. It is a hormonal problem driven by what you eat and the signals those foods send. Protein and fat send the right signals. Carbohydrates, particularly refined ones, send the wrong signals. The hack is simply directing your meals toward the signals that serve your body rather than the ones that work against it. People who apply this consistently for 4 to 8 weeks typically notice several things beyond the changes in their waistline. Their energy is more stable throughout the day because they are not riding blood sugar waves anymore. Their concentration is better for similar reasons. They sleep more soundly in many cases because blood sugar instability in the evening, which carbohydrate-heavy dinners tend to produce, disrupts sleep in ways people rarely connect to their food. And perhaps most practically, they stop thinking about food constantly between meals, which frees up cognitive space that most chronic dieters have no idea they were spending. Your body is not broken. It is not refusing to cooperate out of stubbornness or some metabolic defect specific to you. It has been given the wrong inputs, and it has been responding to those inputs exactly as designed. Give it what it actually needs, adequate protein per meal to trigger the satiety pathway and the mTOR repair response paired with the natural fat that triggers the second satiety signal, and the body's own regulatory systems take over. Hunger becomes manageable not because you are restricting, but because the signals are finally being met. Body fat, including belly fat, becomes available to burn because the hormonal environment is no longer dominated by insulin, and muscle is preserved because the repair signal is being activated consistently at every meal. If you enjoyed this and want to truly understand how your body works rather than just following rules that someone else made up, make sure you subscribe, hit the bell, and turn on notifications. There is so much more to explore, and everything connects. See you in the next one.